No, I really hoped that a colleague from the National Museum of Namibia would be able to present this presentation, but as my Botswana colleague said, it's unfortunately the wrong time of the financial year. So I have to present this as well. And I should say at the beginning that I was not directly involved in this return myself, so I'm also speaking in terms of a summary rather than direct involvement. I did not go to Germany as part of the delegation. I hope everyone is fed up after lunch. I mean, fully satisfied. I'm not too sleepy, so I'll try not to be long. Namibia has had 2 major repatriations of human remains from German university museums to date. A total of 20 skulls were returned by La Charité, although there have also been exhumations of liberation struggle, selected liberation struggle leaders from Angola and Zambia. And I think that's also perhaps an issue that this workshop should think about, how the return of liberation struggle remains might relate to this process as well, in terms of the experience of how that is done. I think with this presentation I'll try and highlight a few points. I'll have to kind of show you exactly why perhaps this is one of the most unethical collections that there could be in terms of unethical collections, and why it was such a powerful thing that these human remains were returned. But I'll also talk a bit about the process and why I think that this is an inconclusive return. I think the process has not ended yet. The first return of mortal remains took place in 2011 after extensive negotiations with the Charité University Hospital in Berlin. A total of 20 human skulls were handed over, which consisted mainly of Herero and Nama prisoners of war who died in a concentration camp established by the German colonial forces in 1905 at Shark Island, just outside the town of Lüderitz in southern Namibia. The hospital had established a team of 5 researchers to investigate as far as possible the provenance and identity of the human remains. The team incidentally also worked on human remains from Australia and New Zealand, and there were returns to those countries from the same collection in 2014. Dr. Bofinger, based at the Shark Island camp, was responsible for the transfer of these remains to Germany. And it was a concentration camp, and I say that because the camp did not just include captured fighters, but also the women and children of that community that was involved in the war. To give you a taste of the situation of the people in the camp, a German missionary at the town, Emil Laff, wrote to the German authorities on the 5th of October 1906 complaining that large numbers of the people are sick, mostly from scurvy, and every week around 15 to 20 die every week. And of the Herero, just as many are dying, so that a weekly average of 50 is counted. On that camp, around, according to the German statistics for this camp, 80% of the people that went to that camp died. In addition to 18 mortal remains that were documented as having been sent from Shark Island, the research team identified the other 2 skulls as having originated from what you might call a private collection, but with little detailed information about them, other than they were the mortal remains of 2 Herero men and, quote, stem from the period of the liquidation of the Herero. Felix von Luschan, director of the Ethnology Museum in Berlin, had requested skulls from Namibia. One of the German officers, Lieutenant Zern, replied that the prison camps would make a collection of human remains easier. Quote, since in the concentration camps taking and preserving the skulls of Herero prisoners of war will be more readily possible than in the country, where there's always a danger of offending the ritual feelings of, in his words, the natives. It is clear that the proposal of obtaining mortal remains from the camp was followed. However, there's little evidence of any concern about the feelings of the people in the camp. Instead, there is evidence that women prisoners, at least at another concentration camp at Swakopmund, were used first to boil the heads of fellow prisoners, who they probably knew, to scrape the flesh off the skulls, and then to pack them into crates to send to Germany. It seems possible that the 2 Herero skulls that were repatriated in this repatriation may have resulted from this process. And the nature of this collection is such that many in Namibia see these skulls as silent witnesses supporting Namibian claims that Germany pursued genocidal policies in its conquest of Namibia. The return was highly emotional, particularly as the 20 skulls that were returned included 17 which had featured in a German scientific journal, which featured horrific photographs of the decapitated heads of the victims. I'm going to show a few photographs, but I apologize. This is one of the few photographs we have of the Shark Island camp. It's on the Atlantic coast, fog, freezing cold, people with inadequate accommodation, and this is just rocks that people are trying to sleep on. You can see the occupants of the camp, women, children, the whole communities of the Nama community and Herero community were sent there. And the death rate was, as I said, around 80%. That's another one of the photographs. This is the camp in Swakopmund. And this is actually a postcard that was made showing human skulls being crated up and sent to German museums. Okay. This is just evidence of the burial ground outside Swakopmund, where we believe many of the victims of the Swakopmund camp were. This is Google Earth. This was a formal cemetery, but this is what we believe are the remains of burials from the camp. It has not been conclusively proved yet. Okay, I'm going to show you one horrific image. But the communities, as I say, they feel very strongly that these images are proof of the horror of what was done to them. So if you don't want to look, I would close your eyes now. It's a really horrific image. This is one of the heads, of the 17 heads that were sent to Germany, and you can see how they were displayed and categorized. And basically, this was for research on facial muscles. Let me remove it. There were research on facial muscles as part of a research project to show, in terms of evolution, that Africans were evolutionary lower than Europeans. So they were looking at facial muscles in terms of the research. So this is the horror of the background of this particular collection of human remains. And so, of course, it was very emotional, the return of these remains, of the skulls of these people. A large delegation of 54 Namibians travelled to Berlin to receive the 20 mortal remains in September 2011. In addition to government officials, there were many representatives of different Nama and Herero traditional authorities. However, as I've said, these representatives travelled as delegations from 3 different organizations, representing campaigning groups, campaigning that the German government acknowledged the events that took place in Namibia as a genocide. They also demanded an official apology and economic reparations. And the way in which the return was managed by both the German government and the Namibian government was viewed as reflective of the seriousness with which they took a campaign for recognition, apology, and reparations. And this is another issue, how the process is always political. How it is done is viewed by people in a very critical way, because there are other agendas always attached to the return of human remains. The 20 mortal remains were officially handed over on the 30th of September 2011. The mortal remains held by the Charité incorporated those that had previously been held by the Anatomical Institute of Berlin University and the mortal remains from Berlin's Museum for Völkerkunde, Museum of Ethnology, whose collection had been transferred there in 1986. The research team at the Center for Anatomy at Charité indicated that the information showed that 9 of the human remains were from Herero communities and 11 from Nama communities. The mortal remains included 4 women, 15 men and 1 4-year-old child, but none could be individually identified by name. One of the requests from the Namibian delegation was to obtain further information about what had been done with these human remains after they arrived in Germany. And this is where the research was showing what research purposes they'd been used for and the issue of facial muscles. The arrival of the mortal remains at our international airport, Hosea Kitako Airport, was a major event with huge crowds of people of Herero and Nama, particularly community, greeting the arrival of the remains at the airport and chanting traditional battle cries in Ochiherero, on Bimbi for the men and on Doro for the women, different war cries, and also accompanied by traditional praise singing. A mixture of traditional rituals, such as one carried out at the Iharui shrine, took place, as well as Christian prayers. And I think for me personally, having the honor to participate in this morning's ritual, I think in communities there is a mix of tradition and Christianity, which is reflected in the way communities like to accept the return of human remains. In this case, the human remains were displayed overnight at Parliament Garden, as is done with a state funeral, for members of the public to come and view them, before being transported to Hirazeka for a memorial service. The second return of mortal remains to Namibia took place in 2014 and involved 2 German institutions. On the 5th of March 2014, Charité handed over a further 21 human remains to a Namibian delegation. This time the delegation was much smaller, only consisting of the Minister of Culture at the time, the head of the National Museum, and the Deputy Chairman of the Council of Traditional Leaders. So it was a much smaller delegation. And that met with some criticism because it was actually a larger handover. It was the handover of 35 mortal remains. One point of significance was that in this case, out of the 35 mortal remains, 4 of the people had been identified by name. But still, the lack of detailed information made it difficult to link even those named. It was actually 4 women who were named, but to identify them and link them to the community was still a challenge. The most important point I think I want to make about the 2 returns is that the lack in Namibia of a clear policy framework and disagreement between those who represented the communities from which the mortal remains originated have resulted in indecision and inaction. So I'd say that these returns, even though they took place in 2011 and 2014, are incomplete. The secretary of one of the committees represented the view of about 10 Herero chiefs, but as a matter of principles, the skulls should not be buried. They argued that the skulls of Herero and Nama prisoners of war should not be buried once they returned to Namibia, but be preserved professionally. The reason that they gave was to keep the memory of this part of Namibian history alive. But in contrast, other traditional leaders, especially from the south, argued that the mortal remains of the returned should be buried possibly in Shark Island, where they had died. The Namibian government argued initially that the human remains should be buried as an act of nation building at Namibia's Heroes Acre, but communities also disagreed with that. And the fact that the mortal remains that were returned in 2014 were more culturally diverse also enabled them to fit into a longer narrative of a nationalist liberation struggle. So President Hifikepunye Pohamba, when he received the remains, said the following: "I wish to point out that some of the human remains in front of us here today have been classified as belonging to our forefathers from the Herero, Nama, Ovambo, Damara and San communities. This demonstrates that our struggle against colonialism was a national struggle from the beginning, hence the argument they should go to a national shrine." And also I should point out, when he spoke, he made a pledge which is relevant today. He said, "It is our vow that wherever mortal remains of our heroes and heroines are found and identified, we will make every effort to repatriate them to the land of the brave, where they belong." The government announced that it was the decision of our government that these human remains will not be buried, but be entrusted to the care of our National Museum as part of our historical record. They will be available to members of the public, scholars and other visitors who wish to witness this painful part of Namibian history. So at present, the Namibian government's position has been not to bury the remains, but there's been a lot of debate about this. And if you go to our new Independence Memorial Museum, you'll see that a lot of people visiting there are asking, where are the human remains? And then when you get in the lift, this is our Independence Memorial Museum, very shiny, you'll see a small sign next to the buttons on the lift saying that there are no skulls or human remains exhibited here. The museum has not wanted to display them. So I'd say that this whole return is still inconclusive. There's no finalization of the process. The 35 mortal remains that were returned from Germany are now in a storage room at the museum, still awaiting a final decision about their future.
It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here today, talking about a repatriation activity that is complete, that I was centrally involved in for many years. In one sense, it differs from the discussions today because it is about archaeologically derived remains, not unethically derived remains. On the other hand, what I've chosen to do is to focus on the mechanics, the steps that we went through in completing the repatriation of over 1,700 ancestors to the care of the descendants, the Huron-Wendat people of Canada. So I thought it would be appropriate for us to begin with the words of a descendant. And I have this little video that I hope will work. And it's 2 minutes. Oh, first I'll explain the part of the world I'm talking about. I'm sorry that there's not a picture of North America there, but I hope in the inset you recognize the Great Lakes. This part of Canada, where the Huron-Wendat nation resided before European contact, is amongst the Great Lakes in what is today the province of Ontario. It's not very far from the American cities of Buffalo and Detroit, to help you orient. Although the people I meet in Cape Town all seem to have relatives in Canada, so perhaps I'm underestimating your geographic knowledge. So what I'd like to do is to escape, because you're saying that I hit escape.
So now it's out, and then it's just on this.
Oh, then I have to diminish. All right. We hope this works.
Very happy to be here to witness, this exhibit, and I'm confident that this will provide people with information and will help, to know one another better. Unfortunately, Canadians do not know a lot about Aboriginal peoples, and we have to walk away from the stereotypes. And Aboriginal peoples, have given a lot to Canada and are still giving a lot to Canada, but we have to make it public. And again, the university is a key player in this role. But I was told by the archaeologist that because of the design of the part, you can tell if it's Haudenosaunee or Wendat or Scandinavia. So So it was a kind of a brand, you know, the way they made the design on the rim or on the pot itself, and it looks so perfect, you know, when you look at it. And it's all handmade, you know, it's not made by a machine. Also, as I said, for the arrowheads, you know, those are real piece of art. The university, they have the names of my people. They have a large, if I may say, collection of our people. And you're right, you know, we negotiated with the university to repatriate those names. And in September of this year, we're planning to rebury them in the area here. It will be a public event. We want to make something positive about this. What I hope sincerely is this will be a eye opener for the students and also for all the people who come to the university. It's to bridge, you know, with the past, but also with our present, and also to make a better future.
Okay, now I have to close it. Those remarks were at the opening of a display in the department. Sorry, okay, just close it. And open the slides. My notes aren't actually showing. On September 13th, September 13th, 2015, there was a celebration of the Huron-Wendat in Ontario, here in the Great Hall at the University of Toronto. About 200 people participated in a day of talks that were translated into both French and English, because the Huron-Wendat people speak French. And we talked about what archaeologists had learned about their ancestors. And on the previous day, a much smaller group of people had met with representatives of the Huron-Wendat to discuss with them the research potential of the tissue samples that the Huron-Wendat had authorized the University of Toronto to retain. And so one of the things that makes this particular repatriation unique is the retention of small bits of tooth and bone from the ancestors who were reburied. The subsequent day, after those discussions, the remains of 1,700 skeletons from archaeological excavations were reburied in a ceremony that was attended only by the Huron-Wendat. I have no pictures, no videos, no documentation at all of that ceremony, which, as they pointed out, was a family affair. But to lead up to that point, memoranda of understanding were necessary between the University of Toronto and the Huron-Wendat Nation, and also with the Ontario Heritage Trust, who were the owners of the land, and the Huron-Wendat Nation. And the documentation of how we did that and all is available in a paper that I believe the organizers of the conference have on hand, written by me and one of the Huron-Wendat community members, Louis Lesage. But what I want to focus on is the steps leading up to that event. And I'm not going to go through all the details of these slides, just to say that these are steps that we took, and I anticipate that any group of people would need to go through some of these steps, analogous steps. One of the important things as our discussions developed was the definition and terminology that we were going to be using. For example, the Huron-Wendat were not keen on words like bones and specimens and individual, as though the person didn't have a sex or an age or a personhood, things like that. And even, what does the word descendant mean? And we also had to discuss the proposition made by the university to the Huron-Wendat community that we retain one tooth per person and small bits of disease-altered bone. I put the word bits in quotes here because, in fact, even the word to describe the small bit of bone was important. They did not want us to talk about it being a specimen or they didn't want it objectified. We had to be careful about our wording. This is a list of the archaeological sites that were included in the reburial, and all I want to focus on is the column called Initial Excavation. You can see that these were excavations by University of Toronto archaeologists from a pretty long time ago. The most recent collection came out of excavations in 1975. And that was the year in which the province changed its heritage legislation and made the excavation of large burial sites much less straightforward. Basically, they stopped the excavation of large burial sites. So we retained one tooth per person. Why did we want to do that? Because a single tooth can tell people a lot of things about their ancestors. And we made the proposition, it was discussed within the Huron-Wendat community for a long time, and they concluded, according to their spokesperson, that a single tooth, which is the kind of thing you wouldn't take home from the dentist's office, would be a gift that the ancestors could give to their descendants in order to tell those descendants more about their lives. It happens that a tooth is made of a number of different component parts, and those component parts can tell us information about people, and I'll get back to that at the end. The small bits of disease-altered bone link to the fact that these ancestors from before European contact in North America suffered from tuberculosis. These are two pictures of spines where the bone of the spine has been affected by tuberculosis. Now these are large specimens so that you can see the dramatic alteration of bone that sometimes happens with TB. We now know that the kind of tuberculosis that they suffered from in Canada is different from the kind of tuberculosis that originated in Europe, and that again is different from the kind that originated in Asia. There are different kinds of tuberculosis, genetically speaking, and so the Huron-Wendat have allowed us to retain small fragments that can help through the study of the DNA of that tuberculosis, learn more about what that strain was like, and help with treatment today, because that strain is still in the mix today. So here's the main focus of what I want to share with you, the timeline to repatriation. It took a long time. You will not be surprised at that. Starting in 1999, the Department of Anthropology that was holding these collections developed a policy that was positive and proactive toward repatriation. They then had a consultant's report from two well-established museum curators to try to give us some guidance on how to go about things. And we sought money. We sought money from our federal funding agencies, and we were denied because this wasn't research. In fact, they just didn't have a category for the sort of proactive preparation of materials for reburial that we wanted to do. During the negotiations, starting in 2005, formal talks to develop the Memoranda of Understanding began between lawyers, academics, and descendants. And just as an aside, I was a participant in those talks. I remember the first talk that I met the newly elected Grand Chief that we ended up working with, and he'd ask me a question. And I'm an academic, and so I always start out with, well, it's complicated. There's this, and then there's this, and there's this. And he, looking a lot like my uncle, would just give me that look and say, it's not complicated, it's simple. You know, his point was, we know what we want to do, we're just going to do it. And I was amazed how many times I said it's complicated. And every time he said, It's simple. We know what we want. So in 2012, the Department of Anthropology opened a small permanent display. You saw bits of it in that video. And we asked the University of Toronto for some money to help prepare for the repatriation. And they did provide some funding for some additional staffing. The repatriation event was in 2013. Of the 3 First Nations groups that we began negotiations with, only the Huron-Wendat actually followed through. The other groups decided for various reasons it wasn't the right time for them. So indeed, it's only a portion of the University of Toronto's holdings that were reburied. And we got more money for that. Oops, sorry. But I do want to point out that because of the retention of these tissue samples, the repatriation was not the end. Going forward, we continue to curate those tissue samples on behalf of the descendants. They do not belong to University of Toronto, they do not belong to the province of Ontario, they belong to the descendants. And we are generating research publications. So to give you some idea of what we did during the first step, I'll just put these up, and because I'm running short of time, I won't spend much time on them, but initially we had to set aside the potential samples in a manner that would allow us to put them back. At the time of repatriation, we needed to prepare the human remains in boxes of consistent size and weight. By tradition, the Huron-Wendat women would deliver their loved ones to the burial site, and so these had to be small boxes that were readily handleable. And we needed to provide space for cleansing ceremonies, what we call smudging ceremonies. We had to arrange for privacy, and we had to assure that there would be no photography, no sound recording, and no unauthorized personnel, and no press releases, because that's what the descendants wanted. Afterwards, we've developed a database. I could explain to any interested curators how we set up the system to make sure that every tiny bit of tissue is individually identified, so that when they're loaned to researchers and returned, we can keep good track of them. And we store the material in a space that is undesignated on public maps, and that is respectfully and carefully and quietly maintained. These are just some of the publications that have been generated so far from these collaborations with the Huron-Wendat. We've learned about the tuberculosis DNA. We've learned about when women weaned their babies. We've learned about the extent to which the warfare that happened after European contact disrupted the lives of every person in that community. And so we go on, because repatriation, instead of being an end point, was actually the beginning of a new kind of relationship between the institution that did the archaeology and the descendant community whose ancestors we were learning about. And I thank you for your attention.
Physical Anthropology at the Canadian Museum of History. My paper today is Human Remains Repatriation, Experiences from a Canadian National Museum. The Canadian Museum of History, or CMH, maintains for research purposes human remains collected from most of the 10 provinces and 3 territories of Canada. These physical anthropology collections hold approximately 5,000 catalog numbers. A catalog number can represent a single skeletal element or part thereof, a complete skeleton, or multiple skeletons depending on how the remains were cataloged over the past 150 years. The remains are held in the curatorial wing of the museum in a separate section of the collection space on the 5th floor, in drawers within steel cabinets. The majority of the remains held at CMH are from indigenous populations and were collected prior to 1980, mostly through excavation by staff archaeologists. Very little was collected after the 1980s, reflecting a change in sensitivities and the diminishing cultural acceptance of collecting human remains for curation. Access to the collection is governed by the CMH's Human Remains Policy, which stipulates what requirements have to be fulfilled prior to access. In 1992, the Assembly of First Nations Canadian Museums Association Task Force on Museums and First Peoples provided a report which outlined recommendations for the care and handling of First Peoples collections housed by museums. Based on recommendations in this report, the CMH drafted and adopted a repatriation policy. The CMH's first human remains repatriation occurred in September of 1995 in Ontario to the Six Nations Council and included 416 physical anthropology catalog numbers and 150 grave goods. To date, the museum has concluded 18 human remains repatriations involving 2,017 physical anthropology catalog numbers and 17,570 grave goods. We are currently working on our largest single repatriation that includes 1,100 physical anthropology catalog numbers, which equals about 25 cabinets, and a yet-to-be-determined number of burial goods. The process of repatriation has developed over the course of the past few decades, as we, as an institution, adapted to the various needs from the individual requesting groups and learned from challenges encountered before, during, and after a repatriation. Of the 18 human remains repatriations at the CMH, I have been directly or indirectly involved in 17. As I explain the process that is currently used, I will pull into the discussion case examples from my experience. The process usually begins with an information request. This can take the form of a simple request from a descendant group, or it could be information needed by federal negotiators sitting at a land claim or treaty table. The information generated is usually based on geographic location, since our physical anthropology collections are cataloged this way, and not by descendant groups, which is sometimes difficult to identify given the antiquity of some of the remains. We therefore ask the requesting group to provide us with a map to define the territory relevant to their request. A report is produced and passed on to the relevant group. It is up to them whether they want to follow it up with a repatriation request, which must come from the head of the specific descendant group, or they could decide not to move any further in the process. Repatriation requests can come via letter, email, or through alternate means. For example, we received one repatriation request from the Algonquin representatives on an animal skin. When a repatriation request is received, research immediately begins on the collection, including any background data on the find, identification of related burial goods, inventorying, and analysis of the remains themselves. Destructive analysis, for example, ADNA or diet, can only take place if the requesting group approves it. Though human remains are segregated in the collection rooms, there are instances where human remains are found elsewhere in the museum's holdings. For example, if stray human bones, either complete or partial, were found during an excavation, but not identified as human in the field, they could be found among site artifacts or faunal, non-human animal remains, which are held in an alternate storage space. In the early days of repatriation, it was not considered a priority to locate these missed human remains. However, after a couple of repatriations in which we had to return to the requesting group with this added identified material, we made it a priority to proactively seek out these unidentified human remains and ensure that a repatriation was complete prior to leaving the building. Given the antiquity of some of the remains in the collection, they can be ancestral to multiple descendant groups, especially in British Columbia, where the highest incidence of overlapping land claims in Canada exists. It is important that all descendant groups agree to a repatriation. In such incidences of overlapping claims, the CMH will identify the descendant groups they believe could have competing interests in the remains. This list is provided to the First Peoples group, who must contact those who could possibly file competing claims and ask that they provide the CMH, in writing, a letter relinquishing their rights to the remains. This process was developed over time as the museum experienced issues of competing claims and has proven the proper way to proceed, since it gives a voice to all the recognized descendant groups and proof of consultation years after the event. Once overlap issues are resolved and inventorying and data collection is complete, The CMH will produce a report for the requesting group to assist in their preparation for the return of their ancestors. It will also produce an inventory to accompany a request for deaccessioning. According to the Act of Parliament that established the museum, only the Board of Trustees has the legal power to transfer title and possession of objects in the National Collection. Since the Board only meets every 3 months, there are only small windows of time where deaccessioning can take place. Immediately after the Board approves a deaccession, the requesting community is notified, and arrangements to transfer possession can proceed.
Find also enough discussion going forward on the Prestwich Memorial and Visitor Center. Previous speakers have said that they felt that they were inadequate to speak about the topics. I think there's a bit of a lie in that from what I've been listening and hearing. But I can tell you the truth is that my involvement with the Prestwich Memorial and Visitor Center is only as a facility manager. So I'm totally honest with regards to that. There's people in this audience that I know that has been involved with the Prestwich site since inception, and that are much better equipped to actually be standing here. But I'm going to give you what I have about the Prestwich Memorial, and then we can take it from there. Thanks. The memorial itself is bound by Buitengracht, Somerset, Kapini, and Waterkant streets. It's on the edge of the city centre, and it forms basically the gateway to the Greenpoint area. The square where the visitor centre is.
Sorry, just going to put this up. We can hear you perfectly well, but
Okay.
you seem to be straight. Is that better?
That's
Better, right?
as long as you can hear me. Okay, the square is known as the St. Andrew's Square, probably named after the St. Andrew's Church, which is to the left of the square. There have been some discovery, I think, with the excavations of and the development of the visitor center. As you can see to one of the pictures, it's the old tram lines, which was found during excavations. And what happened was that they decided to leave it exposed so that today people can see that those used to be the old horse-drawn trams that moved between the city and the Greenpoint area. The area where the memorial is also known as the District 1 area, and that was a narrow strip of land that basically ran from the castle right up to the lighthouse area. The memorial itself was designed by the Cape Town architect Lucien Lagrange. It was very specific designed brief that was given to the developer, and I think most of that was basically to look at the sensitivity of the space, and then designed a visitor center that can actually express that as well. The site where the visitor center is built used to be the early Dutch Reformed Church burial ground. Today there's still a remnant of the original burial wall, boundary wall that is on the site. Part of the brief was also to design the space as it will accommodate 2 ossuaries, and that will then be for the final resting place of the remains that were found in the Greenpoint area. The minimum requirement was also to build the space that should be dry and ventilated. And I must say that also part of our maintenance was during last year we did find there was some damp issues, and we've brought in a contractor to look after the place and repair, and they did some waterproofing to the tune of about just 400,000 rand, and that has been completed towards the end of October, November 2016. It is a public space, so it's always open 7 days a week. During the week, it basically runs from about 8 o'clock till 5, 6 o'clock. Weekends, it's on the Saturday and Sunday from about 8 till 12 or from 2. The arrangement that the city has is with the current lessees is that once they open that the facility is open and people can then enter the memorial. There's no cost involved. How it was built, there was a memorial garden on the outside of the one ossuary. That's a bit of a grass area. We've installed some benches there. And people can then, individuals and groups can come and use the memorial garden to express their feelings with the site. To the center of the building, we've got the visitor center. There are 2 entrances, one on the Somerset Road and one on the walkway. I think the one on the Somerset Road was designed as the main entrance, but because of the walkway, the fan walk now, which is mostly used, people are inclined just to use the entrance from the walkway. Then we've got the inner ossuary, and one can access that from inside the visitor center. There are a group that is managing the Prestige Memorial facility, and that is made up of representatives from the City of Cape Town, from SARA, the Cape Town Heritage Trust, the Greenpoint City Improvement District, and also Heritage Western Cape. Some of the responsibilities that they have is the city as being the landowners, and they are responsible for the general upkeep and the maintenance, and that they do by way of the lease agreement that they have with the Greenpoint CID. SARA as the custodians of the ossuary and the associated cultural material, and then Heritage Western Cape, and then the Cape Town Heritage Trust. What has also happened was that Prestige Memorial Trust Fund was established, and that is just one, whenever there's an opportunity to generate some income, that those money actually gets paid into the Prestige Memorial Trust Fund. In that way, I think it's also an opportunity for those, whatever money came in, to be plowed back into the memorial. Now I really feel I can't speak about the background of the establishment of the vicinity. But yes, the discovery was made in 2003. There was widespread interest across the city, and I believe at the time there was insufficient space to actually house these remains. Then what followed after that was a ministerial directive by the Minister of Arts and Culture at the time, and it read something like, the City of Cape Town, in consultation with SARA, construct a suitable memorial park or garden on an appropriate site in the Greenpoint area where the Prestige Street remains can be interred and any further finding of skeletal remains, and that such a park would become the focus of the community's memory and learning about the past. And here we can see a picture of the site. The circle marks the site of the Prestige unmarked burial ground. The envisaged objectives of the Memorial and Visitor Center, primarily to provide a space and place where individuals and groups can interpret and express the ideas about the cultural past and future by providing, amongst others, a memorial garden, place for community activities, learning, public exhibitions, hosting of seminars and workshops, outdoor theatre, where living memories can be recorded. During September, mostly when we have Heritage Month, the city have a program where they bring out school children, learners to various sites within the city, and Prestwich Memorial is one of those sites which they bring those learners to. These are pictures of the displays that's found inside the memorial. And we left some of the brochures at the door so people can actually have a look at some of the information in there. I only came on board 2008. These were already in place. There was a blessing ceremony that took place. Various leaders were involved. What I can say about today, what the purpose of the ossuary, there was to provide a dry and ventilate space. We had some issues, I must say, on the outside with rodents. We've seen to that. The security is provided by the Greenpoint CID. And then the challenges, I think there are different perceptions of how the site needs to be managed. And I agree with that. There are currently no protocols in place for receiving new remains. We sometimes do get remains that is in inappropriate boxes, basically wine boxes that comes in. Some gets brought to us with plastic bags as well. There are no curator available or employed for the cultural material. And so all of these things are inconsistent with the SARA repository standards. And there is also no security in place for storage of associated cultural remains. Sorry. I think Prestwich Place has got more questions and answers. It represents about 4,000 people who lived in Cape Town during the 18th century and were part of a diverse population living under diverse conditions, united by death. At the time, there was agreement that no scientific research must be carried out on the remains. It's again one of those questions that needs to be asked. If going forward, one needs to relook that point of view. I'm not equipped to answer that. There are a couple of things which the research would be able to tell us. It's listed there, some of the diet, the growth, disease and causes of death, practices, beliefs and attitudes. I think one of the bigger things for us going forward is a retrofitting of the ossuary to meet the SARA Museum repository standards. And certainly we're not equipped also to be able to do that. There needs to be interaction and discussion with the various role players. And that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you. That is unacceptable. That is unacceptable. Please, the city of Cape Town will either face a High Court order. No. This has been dragging on long. Either we will summons you by a High Court order of the Cape High Court, but we want answers from the city of Cape Town and SARA. You are accountable, sir. We want answers.
Sorry, are you able to stay?
No, I'm not able to stay.
Because I think that's before we go into the discussion, it's just to establish that if you are able to stay.
I'm unable to stay, but I've made arrangements with my colleague to be here.
I will face the High Court on his behalf.
It's of no consequence.
Will you come? It's so hard. I remember the first time when I became aware. I mean, I've been working in a museum for about half of my working life. And when I became aware of human remains in a museum, I was completely blown. And I still, as I'm sitting here, I'm struggling as I'm listening to people talk about collection, but we're actually talking about people. We're talking about inventories. We're talking about strange, the terminology is really, really hard to listen to. And
Yes.
I think it's all about the humanity and how we deal with that as well. So I'm going to appeal to everyone's humanity in this conversation. Seriously, I'm smiling, but I'm really serious because I think we want to get to it. I've got a feeling that we're not going to get to a place where we want to be, but I also would like to request people to remember that let us not, I don't know how we're going to do this, but we can't let press switch dominate the other speakers as well. It can't be about press switch, but if press switch is such a big issue, there is maybe over tea people must decide on the strategy going forward to take that up further, but there's not going to be enough time to deal with all of that. But maybe I'm just preempting. Sir, you were dying to be on the
First of all, it would have been good rather that we pretended that press switch didn't happen. That would have been best for everyone at this venue. I want to touch on that last and say thank you first to the speaker from Namibia. You are providing a lot of value to the value chain that we badly need in terms of how do we take this forward. The same with the speaker from Canada. We don't have enough skills in this room to deal with a matter of this magnitude. We're dealing with a collective memory that spans probably 1,000 years. Those whose remains we're dealing with that laying in boxes are also the descendants of 6 to 8 to 10 generations before them. So we would appeal that we get as much expertise as possible to help us handle this matter. Now getting to the city of Cape Town. The city of Cape Town and SARA had absolutely no business dealing with something of this magnitude. First of all, in terms of definition of mandate, SARA needed some clarity and perspective first in terms of the interpretation of many parts of their mandate, which clearly, when it comes to the burial of human remains and the identification of human remains, first of all should have told SARA first either to get professional consultants' advice or to go to legal resources and get perspective, because what SARA did and the city is open themselves up for what you can call it grand slam lawsuits. Yes, it's funny if you have a lot of attorneys that can defend yourself as a city and you don't have to pay for it, but it's unfortunate. It's been brewing for 3 years. It's coming. Probably by the end of this year, you're going to look at high court applications against the city and SARA for the handling of the press switch matter. It is the biggest disgrace in the city of Cape Town since the torture of human beings at the castle and the imprisonment of indigenous leaders. Now, I'm not condemning you as an individual or as a person who's merely a worker of the city. Unfortunately, the people responsible is not here, but press switch is a scandal and a disgrace. You're sitting on a manifest, what you call as a manifest, of the sum of about 250 years of Cape Town history, since the arrival of the Dutch East Indian Trading Company and their administration, where they had a central dumping ground for everyone that was murdered at the castle and was murdered because the slaves had a property value to them. So they had to get consent before a slave could get killed, because the master would lose his value in his trading property. So what you have the sum of 450 years of evil represented in press which in our spiritual realm constitutes a yoke over the Cape Town area from a spiritual point of view. That's why many in our communities believe we have a flood of blood in the Cape Flats every day in gang-related violence that our people believe emanates from the injustices that is unspeakable. So press switch is a matter that we would have preferred not to pretend that it didn't exist, but it is interfering with a very positive approach that we have started. But you cannot sit with 4,500 remains and still sit with remains coming into plastic bags. You have no capacity. You're managing a politically convenient setup, which the previous administration had no business. They should have at least sourced the professional input of institutions with a similar problem. Like Ezekiel, they should have had the decency to say, Ezekiel, You guys have so many issues. At least come and give us some help with this. So as far as the city of Cape Town is concerned, unfortunately, you can get away with many things. Look, you can get away politically with everything if you run the city. But there's a body of evidence that can rise up along the road and strangle you as a city, and this is one of them. Technically, you're sitting on a site, a genocide, a site of genocide. Now, I would advise you to tell your superiors to go under the Geneva Convention and read up the statute of limitations for prosecutions, and you will be safe from being concealing evidence in mass murder. You will be safe from that, but not morally. This is going to come back and bite the city in the back as well as the provincial government in terms of what you're sitting on there. What you're sitting on is an abomination to our people. It's an abomination to the history of this country. And unfortunately, because nobody spoke anything about it, doesn't mean nothing has been going on the pipelines. The coalitions have been working against the country. The only thing that was lacking was the resources to go to the High Court. Unfortunately for you as the city, those resources have arrived. So press which come like 2017 is not going to be an easy thing on television, especially not for your mayor. Thank you.
Can you tell her if I
You
can
will-
respond
yes.
to some of that? But I
Do you?
think you want
No, I
to
think
pick it up
if
now?
you're ready to respond.
Yes, I think Prestwich Place is a difficult matter for everyone. I think it is something that needs to be addressed at a forum such as this. I would just like to say one thing. Nobody murdered the people who died there. They died of a smallpox epidemic. Death doesn't choose who it strikes. Smallpox kills who it will. And what we have at Prestwich is a period of time, a lot of people died at a very short time span, and in terms how we don't know exactly who's buried there and how they got there, because nobody's looked at it. And I'm not going to enter into that discussion because that is a very difficult discussion which I think we do need to address. And as part of this forum, maybe we can move forward with that. And just again to reiterate, the city made the space available because at the time there was a shortage, and it was a decision made to try and find a solution to a problem that wasn't going away. And the custodians of the remains is still SARA. The city mainly manages the roof over its head. So many of your comments you were addressing, you also need to address to SARA. The city is here because it is prepared to say something about what is happening there, but we are not solely responsible for what is the current state. That is all I want to say.
Thank you. And not to go into the detail of, I mean, I don't want to respond to that because I think there's a lot of, but there has been some research, so there is some knowledge
There is
about it.
some knowledge,
No, no, but what I'm saying
there are, you know, if we are talking about seeing human remains as people, then we need to see the people that are there, and we don't know who they are if we don't ask them who they are.
So-
And we've
so-
not asked them. We've not asked the question, who are you?
Who- It's another debate. There was the hand up on that side. Yes, sorry, yes, sir. You may go ahead. And then I'll this will be the next.
I think mine is directed to Dr. Jeremy's presentation. He has said they still have an inconclusive matter on the issue of how to handle the repatriated human remains, with the debate between government believing that the human remains should go back into the museum, and I think the communities wanting, like the chief has said before, the human remains to be reburied because that is the African culture, and probably the example of Mozambique in Matola, where they've built a memorial site for the departed compatriots. And I just wanted to say, I think this is a very critical point that we shouldn't ignore. As heritage managers in a forum like this, let's talk to it really. it's our culture, we know, we have to rebury them. But in some instances, it's just bits and pieces, the bones, the teeth, and what have you. Do we still want to bury them? Because it's part of our culture, so that the spirit of whoever is laid to rest? Or do we want them to put them in boxes in archaeological collections? Or rather just bury them and do a memorial site where we are still bringing the spirits, you know, the museum in Victoria, where we are believing to have brought all the spirits of the comrades from all over. I think, like I'm saying, it is a critical point that we should all probably talk to and agree on a way forward, really, to say this should be the best approach to this one. And also, there was a point by Febne Jacobs, about restoration of dignity when there's the repatriation, which is still what we witnessed this morning with the ceremony that was conducted in front of the museum by the community. I made note of the priests doing their stuff, and also of the gentleman who had the horn. What are we saying here? How do we restore this dignity? I don't know whether we are talking as Africa here or just as the global community. Which is the best approach? Are we bringing that back in the African way, where we are having that smoke in the horn, or is it a mixture of the two, like we saw this morning? It's another issue that really made me a little bit interested, and was asking myself, but which is which here? Thank you.
Thank you, Renani.
Yeah, responsibly, and I think, I'm disturbed that we've had 55 human remains returned from Germany, and they're sitting in the storage room in the National Museum. I think, but it's, I wouldn't say it's a government against the community. What I think the challenge is that the community has a difference of opinion within its, there are different opinions within the community. Like 10 Herero chiefs were arguing. I think it's because these particular remains, that's why I showed you these images, they're very strongly linked to the argument of genocide as being taken to the German government. And therefore the reference point is perhaps examples like Rwanda, Cambodia, where the remains of genocide victims have been displayed, I would say, in monuments as a reminder or as a evidence of what happened. And I think some of the leaders are referencing that as a point of reference, that they want people to see these human remains as evidence of genocide. And on the other hand, there is, as you say, other leaders who say, no, it's not our tradition, either Christian or non-Christian, to display human remains. They should be buried by the community. So there's, and I think instead of, and there's not really there hasn't been a platform where this can be resolved.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm not going to involve with Prestwich Street. I'm still angry about that, and it's 15 years on. I actually wanted to ask Susan a question. Oh, I'm Alan Morris, who I'm Professor Emeritus now, but I was at UCT, now Hout Bay. Susan, I'm very interested. You talked about the information-based and that studies continue from the Wendat arrangement. But you gave a lovely list of publications, but I noticed they're all actually publications that are not accessible to descendant communities. There's a Nature paper in there and Journal of Archaeological Science. What kind of publications would you recommend which would report back and draw into the descendant communities rather than just the science communities?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Because the descendant community of the Huron-Wendat are French-speaking, first of all, it's terribly important to us that everything that we publish includes a French synopsis. And so we make sure that those written summaries are in plain French language and are provided to the band council. And we work through the band council, and I don't know to what extent the information passed on goes beyond that. We also visit the group because this is a rather different situation in that this is a single descendant group who live in a single region of the province of Quebec, and we can visit them and we can talk with them. Now, we're hoping, and they are hoping, that our collaborations will be encouraging to other descendant groups to get together with other curatorial institutions. So the broader, straightforward publications that I think you're thinking about, the sort of thing that might appear in a popular magazine, that sort of thing, those I think still need to be developed. But this was only 2015 when this, I mean, you know, it's early days, but I don't think that we're doing as much as we need to do to try to emphasize that sort of transformation that Professor Rasool mentioned this morning, where the holders of the materials become the facilitators of the sharing of heritage, kind of an appreciation of heritage, so that those objects, which are actually people, can inform the descendants in a more impactful way.
Okay. Siraj? And then
yeah, there are a number of people in this room, Antonia, Alan, myself, Bonita, who were involved in different capacities at different stages of the evolution of the Prestwich Place matter, and I mean, it is still a very painful matter that we are confronted with, and some regard as a defeat. The ossuary, of course, is a compromise, and it's interesting that when Fahmi read the list of organizations involved in it's interesting that District 6 Museum has been just dropped off as one of the partners in the process, of course, which is still incomplete, because that was stage one. The next stage of the process that was meant to occur was that particular signage and developments were meant to have happened around the Rockwell building, so that the events of that struggle, that very difficult struggle, from which all of us learnt in all sorts of ways, could be told and could be presented as was decided. But what I want to raise is a central issue that has come up in almost all of the presentations. And it also shows a difference between what the experience of our Canadian colleagues and what seems to be emerging as the South African approach. And by the way, internationally, our colleagues in Germany and elsewhere in Europe are already beginning to talk about the South African approach to repatriation involving rehumanization. Right? Now, the central question is the notion of a descent community, and how one can determine through this idea of descent who has the locus standi to bring a claim. It seems like in the Canadian cases, a return, let me not talk repatriation because that is another set of arguments. A return requires the submission of a claim, even if it's written on leather. Requires, and whereas the South African process is already presupposing that South African people and communities have a level of consciousness that they would know that there are things that they can make claims about. And I'm afraid that if we leave it at that in South Africa, you are never going to have anything attended to. And so the South African, the Iziko policy and the policy framework that has been emerging requires museums and carers of collections to be proactive and to actively seek out where and how to go about returns. Now, I mean, at the moment, most of the work that I'm doing is about human remains policy as it is emerging in Germany, where it is envisaged that individual museums that have these collections that are now emerging out of their stores take it upon themselves as individual museums to do the investigation so that they be satisfied in themselves that the people who are claiming are the correct people. In other words, there's a verification process that needs to happen before any return might happen. As if they actually have the standing to do that kind of thing. Because when you're dealing with deep forms of colonialism, it is very difficult often to establish the kind of biological continuity in order for such claims to be admitted. And it's quite interesting that our Canadian examples seem to indicate quite coherent, contained kind of claims and returns that are able to occur. A city like Cape Town makes that impossible. And one of the reasons why the struggles of the people who claim to be the representatives of, to argue for the Prestwich remains, was that according to the appeals committee, they were not able to demonstrate that they were related to the people whose remains they were. They merely made the argument that we are the people of Cape Town. Now, the final point of this is, if this is escalated, if this involves international returns, if this is escalated to a government-to-government process, then it is the business of Namibia that they take charge of the question of how to go about deciding how to attend to the remains. The responsibilities of South Africa is to return them. That is our responsibility. It is not our even if we are dissatisfied with the way Namibia has gone about, the way it has, the inadequate ways in which it has retained those remains initially in an ethnographic museum collection, continuing the violence of that befell those collections. But it is not our place to instruct the Namibians on what they should do. That is a process that they need to go through themselves. Our responsibility is to admit, as the former colonizer of Namibia, that South Africa has to return those remains. Just as South Africa returned archival collections, we need to be able to return those remains. And so that question of descent and who has the standing to submit a claim is something that we really need to discuss.
Thank you, Sarah. Is there we can respond and then Philip and then
I would just say my presentation was very brief, and I wanted to mention that there were still challenges to our decision about dissent on the day of the repatriation. It is not as cut and dried as the Canadian presentations may have led you to believe. And having given several years thought to it, my own opinion is there are pros and cons to a firm, stated definition of an ancestral relationship. There's pros and cons to going the hard data route. And I think there's something to be said for a continued fluidity around the definition of descent. That's my opinion.
Okay.
Thank you. Bishop Templeton Mbego from the Coalition. To the city, I think the city didn't do their research. They must go back. To me, they don't look serious and committed to the process. I understand she is a teacher, not a principal. Next time, in a panel such as this, we need decision makers so that we can go forward with the process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just one last question, please.
That lady has a question and then
I just wanted to add on to what Shiraj was saying in terms of descendant communities. And I almost want to say that we must never forget that centuries of history or the makings of histories denied us the right even to exist within the broader narrative of history making. So to me, if somebody asks me, are you or do you have proof of descendancy, I tend to answer, I don't need to validate myself because history denied me the right to exist. Today I claim back the right to exist and the right to associate to a particular history or narrative or culture. So I agree that one needs to look at the making of history and heritage, but also how it denied certain people the right to exist within that. And I think once we look at that, we'll then be able to move forward in terms of who then is your descendant community and who has a right to claim and on whose behalf. Because I think that sometimes we use this thing of proving who you are. We use that as a way to maintain status quo. And I say that we really need to have that discussion in terms of who has a right to claim. Also taking then into consideration that history almost wrote us out of history, or the making of history in the apartheid or colonial time wrote us out of that culture. So,
thank you. Besides the question from the gentleman there, is there anyone else who wants to? So you will be asking, but I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, I didn't give you an opportunity to respond to the bishop if you wanted.
No, I can't remember what I was going to say, but I'm sure it will come back to me.
Yes, sir. The floor is yours.
Yes, in terms of your question, denying our identity is still the prevailing ethos in South Africa when it comes to Khoi and the Nguni in the Western Cape. But at least elsewhere in the country, the Nguni has enjoyed some recognition because they put their foot down. Here in Cape Town, answering that question, who is buried here out of the 4,500 people? It would be everyone who didn't arrive here with the 3 little ships. Remember the 3 little ships that Jan van der Riebeeck brought here? So that would imply that all those people were here before those little ships landed on our shores, including bringing the disease here, because smallpox is not an indigenous disease to our Khoi bloodlines. So in terms of our legal approach to the Pretswich problem, I'm just giving you a bit of advice on what is coming. 100 lawyers couldn't block that, not with a budget even of 100 million rand, not in any court, definitely not in the Cape High Court. Because a court rules on proximity of evidence when there is a statute of limitation that has expired. Fortunately for us as Khoi, history has been kind on us in some way. You see, the 1913, let me read it to you, the Administration of Estate Act 1930. Now, in that act, what happened is, the Surveyor General, under the Surveyor General Act, and the Deeds Office, under the Deeds Act, were kind enough to register the remaining land in our Khoi names, which means the land that was still in our possession before 1913 were registered in our names in 1913 under legislation, Act of the Union. So no one is going to get away in asking who is laying buried at Presswicks, because it places us within legal proximity of descendancy, because this is the first deceased estates registered after 1913, which places us in earth numbers registered in 1913 in direct proximity of the city of Cape Town metro jurisdiction. So it's not going to be that easy this time around. You see, these papers clearly say, in terms of descendancy, it says here, my great-grandmother, great-grandfather, the earth numbers, according to the Surveyor General, they say they don't make mistakes. They say all the other earth numbers were cut decades later from the original earth numbers. So you're going to be facing the opinion of the Surveyor General and the deeds officer saying, no, they know who the descendants are because they registered the title deeds in 1930, which places those people in proximity of those remains, because the thing is this, saying those people were not Khoi, Peninsula Khoi, which is Khoraghoukwa, Korinaikwa, Korana, claiming that would be another act of genocide, which means washing your hands is one sin, committing another sin on top of that by saying, listen, we have immunity from taking responsibility because we don't know who's laying buried there. It's like, we just killed a couple of guys. We don't say who they are. Just say you don't know them. Just say it's the smallpox. The smallpox killed everyone. Just blame it on the smallpox. It's not going to be that simple this time around. What is happening in 2017 has got little to do with the process that is unfolding with Ezekiel. Ezekiel didn't trigger this. This thing has been triggered years ago with Sarah not being able to account for the amount of consultation and stakeholder engagement. You have corporate companies having a stake in something that has got nothing to do with business. They've turned it into a business exercise, which is an abomination on its own. What we are saying to you is, this is going to court. It's going to court. And it's going to trigger a whole lot of other court cases to that. By people saying, we are the court. This is going to the Constitutional Court in terms of our freedom of association and the very definition of who we are as South Africans. You cannot keep on trampling on our constitutional rights using policy loopholes and policy conveniences by saying we don't have any responsibility in this matter. If I was the city of Cape Town, I would be throwing this thing as far away from our administration as I could. If I was the city of Cape Town, I would be begging Ezekiel and say, take this thing off our hands before this thing blows up in our face. So I'm asking you, please, this issue of identity of who is buried here, you're going to find out who's laying buried there in court papers. I thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm just following on this. And, I mean, I'm not in this area at all, but I'm just looking in on it. And I'm a manager, so I'm always brought up on the belief that to make a good decision, you need need reliable information. So, I just want to ask the question: what role does research play in working on descendant communities? Does it have a role? Is it an ethical thing to look at the genetics of human remains before you actually even know who the descendant communities actually are?
I'm going to resist the temptation of responding to that question, because I think that's the last all we have time for. And am I expected to do a little summary? And just to say that there are a lot of issues that have come out, a lot of them are difficult. There are more questions, I think, that have been provoked by the presentations that have, and there have been some good indicators of ways forward, but they're all context specific, and I think we need to be very aware of that. So we need to find a way of taking these questions into a space that is constructive, and constructive doesn't mean taking away all the difficult issues. I think we do need to deal with it. And so on that note, I think we're going to take a break, and hopefully by the end of today and by the end of tomorrow, we will have had an opportunity to have a more detailed discussion about these issues. Thank you.
What did you say?
Yes,